of oil drilling so we can cripple the fossil fuel industry.
The Utah legislature?
Nothing?
Nothing.
Lame.
Unless you could
Don't we know lobbyists?
make it
Don't you know
profitable
lobbyists?
for the gold mining corporations.
Not for mining and that kind of industry.
But it's like environmental waste. Like, they started using it as fracking liquid because they're like, oh, we're just putting it back in the ground. And then people were talking about how there's a Rolling Stone article that came out January of 2020 about this that like was a big expose, but it got bowled over by coronavirus.
I wonder if
But it was like, but like people were talking about like it in some areas it looks like the red forest of Chernobyl. Like people were talking about like incredible birth defect rates and like incredible problems. And the thing is, this is the reason why I think it's possible, because the oil and gas industry has been boogeymanning radioactivity for the last 100 years. So everyone's really scared of nuclear waste, and they are making nuclear waste. So I feel like they're shooting themselves in the foot.
And now they're also, a lot of them are like rebranding as very environmentally conscious.
Yes. So I think that this is actually doable.
Maybe it's actually, maybe it's not, maybe it's a public campaign is actually more effective. Like a messaging campaign.
That's the other thing that I'm thinking. But I feel like this
if
is
you
something
get it,
that's
if
like...
you get it on somebody's radar who would actually talk about it and suddenly especially somebody who is like a high profile figure who's actually pushing nuclear energy as an alternative.
Yeah, well the other thing is that like if it's one of those things that like if this got on like John Oliver, I think it would be like a huge public outcry instantly. But like I don't even think anybody in the oil and gas industry knows about it. Like this is one of those things that like people knew about it in the 30s, and then it's been so distributed. It's like a Manhattan Project situation where like nobody really knows the scope of it.
Right, everybody's working on their own little niche.
They donated their pipes full that were tainted with nuclear waste to build playgrounds for children. So,
my goodness.
It's like, that's like the most evil thing I can imagine. So I legitimately don't think anybody knows. I don't think any one individual actually knows. The one thing that I think I can do that's actual science about it though, is that there's the thing where modern science experiments they're working with radioactivity to make tools need to use old steel and metal, because new steel and metal is tainted with nuclear radiation. And they say that that's because of nuclear testing. That there's stuff in the atmosphere now.
Probably not.
But the scale is so much bigger for oil and gas, and there's literally no regulation anywhere on Earth as far as I can find. If I can find a correlation with oil and gas drilling, stronger with the incidence of radioactivity in metals across the decades, that would be really strong evidence for the actual scope of it.
It would, and it'd be a good way of publicly sort of formulating it as a problem in a way that will make sense to people and spark, outcry.
Yeah. It's just so wild. Like,
you should email, I'm not even joking, you should email AOC's publicist.
Okay, yeah, no, that's probably a good idea.
She's got like a really potent platform.
Yeah, it's
the kind of thing I could see her using her platform
to do that, genuinely, yeah.
You might even be able to get, like environmentally minded libertarians on board.
Well, the problem is libertarianism was what got us in this mess.
No, but environmentally minded libertarians are really, really anti-fossil fuel and really pro-nuclear.
The other thing is, if I can get a foot in the door with a single California state legislator, and California regulates it even a little bit,
it'll change everything.
It would cascade.
Yep.
So, or there are Texas communities that have complained about it, but I don't think it would move in Texas.
I don't think it would move at a state level.
It would do local. It might move locally in Texas, but like friggin' EPA people came and they were like, well, if people aren't being exposed to the radioactivity, and she's like, we are in my front room and your Geiger counter is reading 8 times above what should be here, like in Ohio. Like, this is ridiculous. I'm getting exposed. My animals all died. Like,
jeez.
It was crazy. So, it's still going. As far as I know, there's been no movement on it at all. And I just learned about it today, and I'm like freaking out about it because it's kind of insane.
I think we'll probably get going in about 1 minute.
drink, you just leave it like that. That's cool. She's wondering if you would braid her hair. Wait, he's not a stripper, baby.
That's not right now, at least.
Make him earn it. It's just sitting there.
This is his bookstore. His other location.
Day job.
This is the art gallery, not the art gallery.
Art gallery and art galleries are the same thing, because you're saying
Right.
That is a very astute
Very
observation.
astute. I did not change the words that I said. You are correct.
You can see us all okay, even though there's 3 of us?
Yes.
Yeah, the connection's slow, but give me just a second. I'm gonna try restarting it.
Oh, so once you have it up and running, don't forget to go get your food.
Yes. Okay, I think we're good.
Think we're good?
Yep.
Okay, you want to push record? Are you already recording now? Or broadcasting? Or do
Yeah.
you need to push record?
No, we're going.
Okay.
We're live.
You good, Esther?
Mhm.
Okay, we're gonna get going then. We have a lot we want to get to tonight. We still want to get out of here in a decent amount of time. So thank you all for being here. Those of you who are tuning in online, glad to have you on board. We've asked Hannah Syriac to be a part of this over the course of the evening. It'll become, other than just that she's cool and brilliant, there's actually like a very specific reason why we asked her to be a part of this. Like I said, it'll become clear over the course of the evening. But she has been a part of, she attended the premiere, she saw the series in advance. She's been a part of some of the discussions here, just in the audience. Is this not on? Is that better?
There we go.
Are these ones on?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, Hannah's been a part of the conversation. She's been participating in the conversation in a lot of public spaces, including in the column that she writes for the Deseret News, which is directly connected to why we want her to be a part of the discussion tonight. And the other thing I will say is that we're not exactly gonna recap. We've got technically 2 episodes to discuss, but it's mostly just going to be a kind of general, we've seen it all now, we've seen the way that it finishes. The conversation is going to presume your familiarity, that you've seen the episodes as well. So we're not gonna sort of recap much. We basically have 3 things on our agenda tonight, and I'll just kind of introduce them as they come. The first thing I want to do is to have each of us, and I don't really care what order we go in, maybe we'll go Dan, Hannah, then me, have each of us just take a couple of minutes and talk about 1 or 2 things that you sort of loved most about the series and disliked most about the series. Okay? So we'll just start there. You take us away, Dan.
Okay. It's an interesting question. I thought the series, parts of it were difficult to watch, and other parts I really enjoyed. I thought the thing that stood out the most in terms of aspects of the series I appreciated was Andrew Garfield's performance.
For sure.
Like, of all the characters in there, I thought his performance stood out. I appreciated the actors who portrayed Brenda and Detective Taba as well. I thought they were also phenomenal in their roles. Some of the other performances were a little wooden.
Some were terrible, some were hit and miss, but some were spectacular.
Yeah, I was not. I don't know, the Sam Worthington.
Yeah, he was very
His-
hit and miss for me.
Yeah, there were parts of it where I just was not convinced. It wasn't a great performance, and Dan's character, or whoever portrayed Dan, I could tell
Captain
they were.
America.
Was that?
Was it Chris?
No, it wasn't.
No,
wasn't-
Captain America Light.
Oh, from the. I don't know. I don't know. what
Yeah.
you're talking
This
about.
is that from the show.
Yeah.
Oh, the.
Falcon and the Winter
From the
Soldier.
Falcon and Winter Soldier.
Oh,
His
that's the
replacement.
one
And
show I
the
haven't
guy that
watched.
replaced Captain America and he was sort of like a Wish version of Captain America.
But he got like really violent or something like that, didn't he?
Yeah.
In the show, I just read. Okay,
And he was good in it too. It was a very good performance, but
you could tell he was giving himself wholly to this role,
Mhm.
but it was I don't know. I've not been around.
it
folks who do
occasionally
that kind of
landed
stuff.
for me, but mostly it felt off.
Yeah, so I thought there were some good performances. There were some rough performances. I thought there were some sympathetic portrayals of certain folks within the church and outside the church, but I felt they were being slotted into kind of stock roles as well, and that was always at the front of my mind. So it was difficult for me to develop too much.
The whole church leaders as Godfather villains.
With the ominous music every single time.
Yeah, that was I tried to put myself into the shoes of someone living in that Mormonism, and it was just like I'm sure there are folks who've experienced Mormonism that way. I have absolutely no doubt, but I have never experienced that, and so it was difficult for me to find any I don't know, anything familiar, all authentic for me personally about the representation of every single leader as conniving and sinister.
Yeah, kind of like
And-
self-referentially sinister.
Yeah, like they knew they were
I'm a bad
being
person
threatening
and I'm
being
threatening
sinister.
you.
Yeah, and so that kind of derailed my my commitment to the series. So it was difficult to watch it at times because of that. I thought I enjoyed the ending. I was surprised
Yeah.
by the ending. I thought it was very thoughtful.
Yep.
I thought the ending at the when they're checking out of the motel and then Detective Pyrie comes home and then ends at the river with his mom. I thought that was very touching. It was not what I was expecting in terms of how they tied it off.
Part of me literally expected like him to do what his wife asked and bear testimony and get up and just bear like ex-Mormon subreddit testimony and storm out, you know? Like, yeah, I'll bear testimony. Church is garbage, you know?
It was.
Bring it so he can marry people.
I did, however, think the tone was not consistent with the whole show in that regard, and so it did feel like there was a bit of pandering as they were tying it off, trying to find a way to say, we're not, we're going to try and bring it back around a little bit for the folks who are getting their feelings hurt, and so.
It makes me wonder if the audience tested the ending or something and maybe made some revision, because it did feel like a marked shift in tone in those last.
And you had, and I thought it was a little too on the nose with Taba's Paiute prayer, and Detective Pyrie asking, do you feel there's power in that prayer? And he's like, nah, not really, but still feels good to say it every now and then. That felt like throwing some crumbs to some folks who are still a part of the community. And you have a question?
I'm just commenting. My assumption with that, because this is like an editing thing. My assumption with that is that they planned for the end of that thematic arc to be the discussion between Bill and Jebediah when they get out of the car and he punches Jebediah in the gut. My guess is that was supposed to be the intended conclusion of that thematically, but it didn't do that, and so that seems like either at a writing stage or in an editing or like in a audience testing stage that they went back and added that secondary conversation because it reached, but it also like but it does it a lot more explicitly, so
And a little more tenderly.
yeah, I've just like seen that happen before in writing, so
Yep. I think that's a good speculation.
Yeah, so I'll pass the baton.
Sounds good. Okay. So my favorite part of the series was definitely the ending. When
You mean when it was over?
obviously, because I got to stop talking about it, for once in my life for the last 3. But I liked that Brenda becomes the protagonist in the ending after the fact. And the reason I like that it's after the fact is, when people were saying that Banner doesn't center Brenda, I agreed with that critique. At the same time, there's this conflict of, should we center someone in the story of their murder or should we center someone in the story of their life? So for me, what the show did that was very compelling is it went beyond what Krakauer did in his book, and it actually did give Brenda some real power. And it's not the same type of power that Mormon women often have, which is just simply remaining in the system. She transcends and becomes a type of savior figure, and then causes,
At least for the women in her circle,
Yeah.
her sisters. Yeah.
yeah, and then causes these women to be able to leave their situations which involve domestic violence. And for me, that was incredibly powerful. I also did like that in the Mountain Meadows Massacre portrayal that they did portray the Paiute side of the story, because I thought that that was really, really important. Most conversations in Mormon spaces don't give any voice to that modern Paiute story that is
They
still
have a memory
told.
of it too.
Yeah, exactly. And so I thought that that was so good. I thought that that was very carefully done. And another thing that I like about this series, which I think most Mormons don't like about the series, is I think it does give us this opportunity to discuss how close to fundamentalism Mormonism can be sometimes. And that's a conversation that I think we really need to reckon with.
Yeah, what parts of the church actually facilitate a certain kind of gravitational pull toward fundamentalism, especially for men in the
Yeah.
church.
And I've been really grateful that the question has been asked of, what can the church do to mitigate this fundamentalism? And for me, the answer was Brenda's faith, right? Brenda had a progressive, thoughtful faith where she knew her own power, where she empowered the women around her. And then in that final letter that she that she writes to Diana, right, it explicitly says, there are some times that we need to reject what's being taught in the church by some leaders, because it's not true, it's not helpful. So I think that
But she does not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh well, these guys are wrong, so we should become irreligious atheists and just only trust our internal compasses or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
There's a big contrast there between, like, is the thing that really protects against fundamentalism the progressive faith of Brenda and the effects that it has on her circle of women, or the reluctant faith crisis and atheism of a newfound atheism of Pyrie and the advice that he's getting from Tava.
I think in many ways her progressive faith is seen as what does actually drive the plot forward, and it's seen as the answer. So in that sense, I actually think Banner is more pro-religion than people give it credit for in some ways, right? And interestingly enough, a lot of non-Mormon reviews say that it's a very thoughtful portrayal of faith. So that's something that really stood out to me. As for something I disliked, I gotta be honest with you. So there's this movie that came out, Kay. It's called Who Killed Joseph Smith? And it's the premise of the movie is that Brigham Young and Willard Richards, right? So this is sort of this conspiracy theory that was around with the RLDS too. So it's not the first time that it's happened.
And it's grounded in the idea that Joseph had nothing to do with polygamy.
Exactly. So there's polygamy denial, which does mean saying that like dozens of women are liars. So I'm very uncomfortable with that. I was not very fond that the idea that Brigham Young killed Joseph Smith appeared in this series, at least in the sense where it was not explicitly portrayed as conspiratorial, because I think it bolsters these fundamentalist ideas that the show tries to critique. And that would be my main critique of the series, is I think it fell right on its face when it did that.
Yeah, like it basically portrays fundamentalist notions of LDS history as actual LDS history.
Yeah.
And I don't know who that's supposed to be helping
Well,
anywhere.
that's the Sam Harris. The most pious are the most fundamentalist.
And the most radical,
right.
Radically
They
fundamentalists are
have
the purists. They're the real ones.
the best claim to being the pious and the real livers of the religion. So I think that's why that's so close to the surface.
I do want to say, though, that Lindsay Hansen Park, who was one of the historical consultants, I absolutely think she's amazing. I think she did a really great job, and she said that she was uncomfortable with that scene, too. But I do think it's important to give credit to Lindsay and her contributions to the show, because I definitely think that when I saw how heroic Brenda was, I kept thinking about Lindsay Hansen Park.
Yeah. And I think that Lindsay's in the unfortunate position of being sort of publicly credited with making the Mormonism real or authentic or accurate or whatever. But at the same time, she wasn't in a position to make any final choices.
Yep.
She's not a writer. She's not a director. And so all of those choices still get made by somebody, no matter what she says. They get made by somebody else. And then, you know, she's a part of the production. She's still got to just kind of like deal with it publicly.
Yeah.
So, but I think I have no doubt that this would have been a worse series if Lindsay hadn't been involved.
Totally agree.
What did I like most about the series? I liked that. I mean, this is going to dovetail a little bit with a couple with what's already been said, but to kind of focus on a particular scene and what I think was a psychologically realistic portrayal of an important phenomenon that maybe wasn't sort of clinically, historically, or like there's no such thing as like the Red Book with all the secrets in it that you just read it and it destroys
You
your
mean
faith
Sandra Tanner's book
or
is
whatever.
that? Darn it, Brad!
But yeah, and it's like the CES letter sort of functions that way in like the consciousness of both like some ex-Mormons, but also some like sort of defensive or embattled Mormons. You know, like there's this thing avoided or whatever. But as a kind of, even if it's kind of like a clunky storytelling shortcut or a plot device or whatever, the actual scene in the car, like the actual portrayal of the agony of like being kind of ambushed with a faith crisis and knowing the implications that it has for your relationships with your family and stuff like that, the difficulty of like, can she support him? How threatening is this to her watching him go through it? Is she in a position to offer support? And just the total agony of it, I thought was really, really, really moving. And in part that's again carried by his performance. It's the kind of scene that if it had been performed badly would have been a disaster. But with Garfield's performance was just I know lots and lots and lots and lots of people, including people that aren't like, obviously people that are big fans of the series, but also people that have been very critical of the series, that watched that scene and felt very like understood and portrayed, not just in the way that that it's sort of staged and written, but like in particular his performance. It came off as so sincere and so touching and so devastating at the same time. So, you know, that and Garfield's performance more broadly were just, I mean, he's a hell of an actor.
I think one other scene I thought of that I helped me get a little more into the last episode was when Diana confronts Sam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought that was very powerful.
It was.
And when everyone around them is just
And then she
ignored.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
such
that
a
was-
powerful
and the
metaphor.
Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was such a great scene. I think that the actor did a phenomenal job. Show him what a coward he is, and she just walks away from him. I thought that was really well done.
Yeah, it was a very potent, very powerful scene. I think the thing in the end that I probably disliked most about it was the sort of constant portrayal. The church can be a very challenging space for a lot of people, and especially a lot of people who have questions, especially a lot of people who are being pulled in either a fundamentalist direction or in a more kind of like progressive direction. It can be a challenging space and an even agonizing space for people that are struggling on really any level with faith. But I'm really not a fan of the way that it sort of portrayed, like, it really had to willfully misrepresent things about the church in order to portray it as the kind of enemy it was, especially to the investigation.
Yeah.
Just get certain things literally exactly like diametrically wrong. Like the idea that the church was upset, that the church would be upset, that the investigation is pointing in the direction of fundamentalists is exactly the opposite of the reality. Like the church would love nothing more than to be able to scapegoat fundamentalists for everything. Oh, they were fundamentalists? Phew, thank heavens. Lean into that in your press conference, please, brother Pyrie.
Well, the church used to go up to Mormon fundamentalists and tell them not to use the word Mormon because they didn't want any sort of connection. They would just shut them down completely, and they'd be like, these are not our people. That was incredibly popular in the 70s and 80s in particular. So I saw that as a little bit inaccurate, to say the least.
It's so like, I mean, we're going to get into this more when we sort of move on to the next section, but like, I think that you have some degree of obligation if part of what you're trying to do is get somebody to recognize and address and do something about certain problems, to not willfully misrepresent the problems. It's an act of bad faith. And I think that, it's of a piece with, it's connected to the whole, like, Kennedys of Utah nonsense.
Wait, I thought the Kennedys of Utah was to make the point that if you're this perfect Mormon family within a ward that helps everyone, that you're elevated to that status within, like, a local...
Yeah.
That's what I thought the Kennedys of Utah thing was doing. I understand. I know that critique has been flying around, so like you can make it and it's fine. I just had to push back.
I mean, I think that there definitely are like I've never been in a ward that didn't have prominent families like that, like families that are very respected, and that happens at just like a very local level. It can also happen. I mean, we have Huntsmans here, and we have we do have sort of like our own versions of the Kennedys, but it wasn't these sort of like grifting chiropractors in like American Form, it was not the Laffertys, like I don't know.
I can see that, but I think the point that I was trying to communicate is that they were that for the ward, but I don't.
I don't even know if they were that for the ward.
Well,
I mean, it's simultaneously like
it's miles around. It's like the ward boundary,
it's simultaneously like these are the most respected people, and also like they've been excommunicated for a long time, and they're weird,
Well, they were excommunicated for 2 years, though.
Right.
Yeah. Well, just
so
a
like
few of them.
they've been excommunicated for 2 years, but they're still so beloved that we have to walk on eggshells when it comes to prosecuting them or investigating them, even though they've been excommunicated for 2 years.
Well, and I think that pulls too to the misconnection not being drawn between members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and these like fundamentalist Mormon groups. That at the end, Tava says something like, who's your God killing next? And I just kept thinking like, it's not his God. Maybe they're different. I don't know. But like thinking that there's not ever really like an effort consistently throughout the series to distinguish, that they are different, and then it just in doing like in what you're talking about, it just kind of shows that right there too.
That goes back to the Sam Harris logic though. Like if you want to find the true Mormon God, find the Mormons, find the weirdos somewhere that have the most like heinous version of God. That's the pure real thing. And the other stuff is the stuff that's been softened by secularity and progressivism and stuff. But like the true believers are the ones that believe in the worst stuff. And that's the pure Mormonism right there. That's the sort of like the I mean it's Krakauer's logic in the book. It's certainly the logic of like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, like this generation of new atheist sort of thinkers that came of age, that came of age, but just springboarded to prominence after 9/11. And Krakauer's book is exactly in that, like is a part of that whole sort of cultural moment.
Ironically, though, right? So while that's true, and while that's what these types of Mormon fundamentalists want you to believe, is that they're practicing like the one true Mormonism. At the same time, I do think Mormonism tolerates that too much.
Oh yeah. No, it does. Yeah. I mean, this is where we're going next. This is a great segue, because I think it's understandable on the one hand. This is something we've to some degree talked about since the beginning. To say, look, like it's clear that with all of the priorities, all of the kind of rhetorical agendas, all of the practical agendas that the show has, it wants to get picked up, it wants to have an audience, it wants to push for award nominations, it wants to get critical reviews, it wants to tell a certain kind of story. Several of the people involved, including Dustin Lance Black, have said that part of what they want to do is provoke sort of questions, like ask hard questions and get Mormons, get us to ask ourselves hard questions and sort of face difficult things. And it's like, there's a little bit of like, okay, I want to ask you a hard question. Have you stopped beating your wife? Right? There's a little bit of like, I'm going to ask you to, if I'm going to try to get you to answer some questions, and then I'm going to frame the questions in a way that's calculated to misrepresent the actual problem, to provoke defensiveness. And then when you react defensively, I'm going to blame you for not being willing to ask yourself hard questions. I think that there is a degree of bad faith in the way that the series is trying allegedly to get Mormons to sincerely ask ourselves hard questions. However, that doesn't mean that we can't still do it. And in fact, we still should do it. We should ask ourselves hard questions, even if they're not the questions that the series is trying to get us to ask. Like, why were Mormons so bloodthirsty that they wanted to murder every Gentile that stepped foot in their territory in 1857 or whatever, right? Which is a really bad question, and it's not a question that you're going to get. Like, it doesn't provoke anything except defensiveness. But ironically, if they had told a more accurate version of Mountain Meadows, and the lead up to Mountain Meadows, and the logic, the conspiracy, the motivation behind actually massacring those people, actually negotiating a truce with them in bad faith, and then massacring all of them except the children, you get closer to a much more important question, which is not why are Mormons gleefully bloodthirsty, but why are Mormons willing to potentially do harmful or do abusive things in the name of sort of circling the wagons? The massacre actually happens because they realize that when they initially attacked the wagon train, which was not to massacre everybody top to bottom, it was just to attack them and steal shit from them, that the Mormons dressed as Paiutes had in fact been recognized. And therefore, these Gentiles, which were like many other Gentiles who had gone through the Utah Territory to get to California, were on their way to California, were going to tattle on us. And Johnson's army was actually already on its way here. It wasn't going to get deployed in a few months to try to arrest Brigham Young for Mountain Meadows, but was already en route. So we were already on like a war footing. We were already hyper defensive, hyper embattled. We were already circling the wagons as aggressively as we could be. And then John D. Lee comes to the high priesthood in Cedar City and says, this is what's going on. What do we do? And then they conspire to murder everybody to protect the church. And that's the accurate portrayal actually poses the harder question, because it's a question that on some level, none of us think we're capable of like slaughtering children to protect the church, but what are we capable of? If like we get into really wagon circling frame of mind, what are we capable of? So what I want to do for the next little bit is say, look, even if we're not going to accept the way the question is framed by the series, we're not going to answer the question on the terms that the series is demanding from us. The series does still raise questions, and you've gestured toward them some already. And I'll just mention one thing, and then we can mention other things, and then we can also have the discussion about what do we actually need to change. If the answer to the question is anything other than read the Red Book, realize that Mormonism is wrong, and then make peace with Mormonism being false or whatever, being a fraud. If the answer is something other than that, if the answer is to actually reform Mormonism, what do we need to reform, and how do we need to reform it? And I would like to start with the observation, which even though this isn't exactly like highlighted and kind of luridly emphasized in the series, it's still portrayed in the series, which is that like Mormonism as a whole tolerates nonsense from patriarchal men, and tolerates deviation from the norm, and tolerates forays into radicalism from men much more than it does, that it tolerates what it perceives as radicalism from women. And that it puts up with a hell of a lot more shitty behavior and abusive behavior from men if it sees their abuse as protecting patriarchy. And that is something that we can ask, even if we don't have to say that, like, oh, everyone's just trying to blood atone everyone or something.
So you have a concrete example. Something I've been thinking a lot about, right, is the father in the series is named Ammon.
Ammon.
And this is obviously to get us to think of Ammon Bundy. I have wondered for a long time, why is it that Kate Kelly, who's really a moderate feminist in terms of ordained women stuff, for which she was excommunicated, asking for equal rights is not radical feminism, why was she attacked so mercilessly, whereas Ammon Bundy and the entire Bundy family are temple recommend holding members of the church?
And somebody could come and you say, oh, well, Kate, she wasn't just asking for women to be ordained. She was building a movement. She was building a following. Ammon Bundy is building a following and has literally, like, published revelations, right? But he is still, like, there's no set of universal principles by which it is appropriate to throw Kate out of the church and not appropriate to throw the Bundys out of church.
And something that I think is also really uncomfortable that we don't talk about is, there are still bishops that are aware of members of the church who are also part of Mormon fundamentalist groups, usually the Apostolic United Brethren, who are living as polygamists, but they still retain temple recommends. But if you support the ERA, well, you're out of luck.
Yeah. If you want more robust LGBTQ rights at BYU, you're more in the crosshairs than if you're quiet. If you have a school of prophets, if you have like these study groups exist. Like if you have a study group where a bunch of guys are getting together talking about polygamy and pure bloodlines from Jesus and Merovingians and Joseph Smith, like sacred kinship and stuff like that. Like these groups exist. They're all over Utah, and we tolerate it. And so there are varying degrees of it, and they get portrayed in different ways. Like there are the actual, like, polygamous break-off groups, and then there are your schools of prophets. I mean, they don't usually call them that, but there are your sort of like radical study groups. There are your Bundys, right? And you get different versions of this portrayed in different ways, including some like the Oregon people.
Yep.
The hippie polygamist, right?
Yep. The Bryant group.
It's all there, and Mormonism does not do a very good job at. I don't want to say this. Mormonism does not police that side of sort of deviation from the mainstream with even remotely the same degree of aggression as it does the feminist queer rights side.
Both institutionally and culturally, right?
At the ground level,
Yep.
there can be some exceptions or whatever,
Sure.
but I would say in general at the ground level, at the ward level, at the stake level, and at the central institutional level, Mormonism is far more tolerant of crackpot patriarchs than it is of moderate feminists.
So to what degree do you think this is driven by the patriarchy of American evangelicalism and our desire to hitch our wagon to that in order to facilitate greater access to power and resources within our country?
I don't know that that's the primary driver, because I think the primary driver is that Mormonism is actually just like very deeply cosmically patriarchal. But I think Mormons and Mormon leaders certainly see, even if it's like a somewhat tentative or somewhat fraught alliance with other patriarchal religious organizations and religious movements as at least a means to an end.
I think if you read like Jesus and John Wayne, the difference between Mormonism in a lot of ways and what's being described in that book is primarily just nominal. Like we do a lot of the same things, and I think for the last century, we've been working to gain a foothold in and particularly since the 70s with the rise of the religious right and the way that they've been able to restructure power in our country. I think there's a desire. I mean, just within the Utah State Legislature, there's a desire to adopt and forward those interests.
Falwell's kind of game plan on how to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Is it possible that the reason why Mormonism is particularly susceptible to this is that it's not the new religious right, it's the fact that like Mormonism as a foundational thing is inherently reactionary? Like being a restorationist movement, it's saying that there's a point in the past that we have lost sight of. And just like sort of like it's not necessarily like it's a petri dish for fascist ideology of like there's an idealistic point turning to is not necessarily as frowned upon as like trying to build something on top of it.
I mean, I think that
Like it's not patriarchy, it's history.
I think it's both, because I think that Mormonism is very patriarchal, is intrinsically cosmically patriarchal, and it's restorationist. But unlike a lot of restorationist movements, the tension between the sort of like the valorization or the reverence for an imagined past is, I think, pretty strongly balanced by a strong belief in like an adaptive church that moves forward via revelation and that can be different. I really think that is a tempering factor on the restorationist side of like it being a too intrinsically reactionary movement. Mormons tend to be constantly reforming and be pretty adaptive, but to reform in ways that feel very, very, very conservative still.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that to reform in a way, in the way we're talking about, the way a lot of people would like to see things go, means diffusing power.
Yep.
It means deconstructing what has been
decentralized.
Yeah, that we have constructed, and that's just intuitively doesn't feel good to folks who have spent so many generations building up, structuring the power the way they have. And so I think and looking to the past, constantly trying to restore what was lost. When you look to the past, what do you see? You see patriarchy, you see these things, and so it feels more natural to go back to those frameworks and to resist the people telling you, no, you have to share that power. You have to bring other people up, even though it doesn't necessarily mean you're going down. It just means you're bringing other people up.
I think you can see kind of the complexity of this issue too if you look at like the way that the ecclesiastical reforms and revelations occurred in Kirtland.
Yeah.
Right, the way that the church was initially structured in terms of its meetings really reflected the pattern in the Book of Mormon, right? And like very, very little centralized power. Joseph was like first elder, kind of equals. But then that led to instability. That led to other people getting revelations. That led to like
Including women.
Yeah. And so suddenly it's like, okay, like we need more hierarchy, and it turns out that more hierarchy is in store. And so the move towards centralization and hierarchy was a move towards stability and away from, away from the sort of like uncontainable possibilities of universal revelation, but also away from primitivism, from Christian primitivism.
But also with women in the church too, when you have the early church women being able to give blessings, and Joseph Smith says this is through the power of Christ, you have women that are exercising priesthood power not contingent upon a celestial marriage. And it's not really until John Taylor, when John Taylor is setting apart sisters for Relief Society, when John Taylor says, no, your power is with relation to your husband. So I like to call this the ghost of Adam God doctrine. It's like the ghost of eternal polygamy.
Right.
But there's this ghost of Adam God doctrine, I think, still in the temple, that, went up to the most recent temple changes where women no longer are called priestesses unto their husbands, right? That idea,
Together with now?
Together with. So that idea, that they're now considered more structurally equal in terms of divinity is pushing back against this earlier Adam God doctrine. And if you make men and women equal, right, that solves a lot of our issues. That brings in inclusion for LGBT people, right? Like that really does fundamentally strike at the heart of our issues.
At least it moves in the direction of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an important step. And I would complicate and sort of add to what you're saying about like the example of women healing early in the church. I think is really important because Because healing is not a priesthood right, actually, scripturally. Healing is a gift of the Spirit. It's not contingent upon gender. It's like other gifts of the Spirit, and you may have it, you may not have it, but women who were healing were exercising a gift of the Spirit. Part of what happened, like part of the explanation for why that gift of the Spirit goes away, or for why women stop healing, is that the priesthood arrogates to itself a monopoly on the gift and basically universalizes it. So healing is no longer a gift of the Spirit, it's a right of the priesthood, which means it has been, like, the priesthood is actually suppressing a spiritual gift in the church. My theory I've had for a while is this is part of the reason why there's so many alternative healing practices in Utah that particularly that involve women.
Well,
They're like women getting involved in this, like it's like essential oils and stuff like that. Like, women actually have the gift of the Spirit to heal. There's no legitimate venue for them to pursue that within the framework of the church. So they have to do something outside of the church that isn't heretical. They're not challenging priesthood authority. They're finding a space independent of the church where they can actually exercise their spiritual gifts.
but I think in general,
building overlooking the Provo City Temple.
Yeah.
yeah. But
And this gallery.
in general, though, what we call religion for men, we call witchcraft for women, right? And that's been a historic. Thank you. It's a good, succinct statement. But I think that's been historically true, is that women's power is always pushed back on. So I do think that that's right. And I would say, too, one interesting thing about Mormon fundamentalism is Mormon fundamentalist groups sometimes do offer women concrete ways to still participate in healing blessings. And I think that that is something that we have to grapple with as, mainstream Mormons, is that there's this idea that there are these fundamentalists who are more backwards than us, but they still provide women autonomy in this one space, right? So that's been something for me. Of course, I would never be a Mormon fundamentalist. I can't do polygamy. But that's something for me that causes me to pause and ask myself, am I demonizing another group of people for something that, we don't even have ourselves?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that of all the different ways that they could expand the role and the power of women, they pick one thing that is in our history.
Yeah.
And not necessarily go out beyond the history. It's still a renegotiation with the sacred
history,
past, and there's still an attempt to curate the boundaries, but doing it with ways that have the authority of that sacred past, rather than expanding, elaborating, innovating, which that can create, that makes the boundaries a lot more fuzzy. And fuzzy boundaries don't make for the kinds of pro-social forces that help institutions, religious institutions, what we label religious institutions, thrive, because they want to have these costly signaling and credibility enhancing displays and ways that we can confidently say this person is faithful, this person is not.
Right.
And the clearer you can draw those lines, the more powerful the institution. And I think that's what a lot of this has to do with, is protecting the institution and keeping those lines as clear as possible in order to facilitate that protection. And a lot of times what we try to paint as sinister is really a defensive mechanism, something that is an outgrowth of our intuitive perception that our own social identities are under threat. We all want to feel like we make good decisions, and that we are contributing members of society, and so our minds have ways of protecting us from feeling bad about those things. And so particularly once you get an institution in place and an authority structure, the folks who occupy that structure are going to be even more sensitive to blurring those boundaries and making it more difficult for them to curate their power the way they want.
Two points I want to make in response to that. One is this helps to clarify why polygamy is a sort of like a thing that always haunts. Like it doesn't just haunt through its through its overt presence in D&C 132 or in plural celestial marriage and that kind of stuff. The ways that it's sort of persistent overtly. But also because all of these dynamics that you're talking about were incredibly complicated by the abandonment of polygamy. Polygamy was just this ironclad divider between us and the world.
The
Between,
strongest identity marker we could have
we could,
developed.
and plus we're in all kinds of isolation. We're in geographic, political, economic isolation from the rest of the world. But all that integration occurs with the abandonment of polygamy, and then it's like, well, what do we do now? What new boundary markers do we erect? What
Word
do
of
we,
wisdom becomes one of
the
the
word of
central
wisdom
ones
becomes a
that-
temple recommend thing. We have to have things, and you can see leaders doing this. You can see like I felt like it was just, for example, it was just as like R-rated movies started to lose a little bit of salience that the 2 earring thing came out. You know, like the timing there was basically exact. Like a generation later. Again, I'm not saying that like nobody cared about R-rated movies anymore, but it had lost a little bit of salience as a marker of identity, in part because it had shifted from being a thing that Mormons don't do to being a thing that pious Mormons don't do, but edgy Mormons do, right? So same with caffeine, right? But so there's a new thing now, like don't do it, don't. And President Hinckley, he didn't get up there and you know pound his fist and say this is a new commandment that is incumbent upon the whole church. Well, what actually happened, the reason why it really took was because BYU ran with it. Once BYU turned it into a black and white thing, right, a part of the honor code, then it became a new thing. And that's all. We're always going to have this with us, and in a certain sense, it is a ghost of polygamy because it is a relic of the fact that polygamy can no longer do this sociological work for us. The other quick point I wanted to make in response to, like you mentioned, it was interesting that they reached for something in our past as a way of opening up a venue for women to exercise gifts. I think especially when you look at non-polygamous like splinter groups, fundamentalist groups, you see another interesting phenomenon, which is groups in which women also prominently exercise the other thing that's a spiritual gift and not a right of the priesthood, but has essentially become a right of the priesthood in Mormonism, which is prophecy. So you have female prophets in fundamentalist groups. So those 2 spiritual gifts are actually, by my read, again, not across the board, but they seem to be more likely to be present among women in splinter groups than they are in the mainline church.
And I think, and that's something that's in our sacred past as well. In fact, this last weekend in Gospel Doctrine, we talked about Deborah, who is explicitly called Neviah, or a prophetess. And there are a couple examples of that we have to kind of gently skirt past when we talk about this, and try to massage the interpretation away from anything that would suggest that we need to, that this should play some role in the constitution of our faith today.
But I think that polygamy, right, entrenches those gender roles even more so than Scripture, right? Because I think that there are avenues to more autonomy for women within Scripture. I think about Miriam foiled with Mary, and how Mary receives this global prophecy, right, that Jesus is going to have this massive impact. But polygamy, the way that the Mormon Church has practiced polygamy, establishes one man with multiple women, which inherently...
It's patriarchal polygamy,
always. Yeah. And I think that we've underestimated, one, how much that has resonated still in the temple, and 2, how much that means we have a lot more work to undo in order to, I don't know, push for equality in a lot of senses.
The most overtly sexist parts of the temple ceremony, even the ones that were just very, very, very recently have seen some adjustment. They were things that were, it was kind of interesting because they were things that almost like, they actually lacked resonance in the modern church, and they didn't make a lot of sense in the modern church, but they perfectly made sense at their point of origin. They perfectly made sense in the patriarchal church of pioneer polygamy.
The way that names work in the temple, right? So like men are told the new name of their wife. Husbands don't tell their wives their new name, right? That's because women belong to one husband, right? That's
just the covenant of obedience, right?
Yep. So that's another relic of this eternal polygamy structure, right? So I've often wondered if, Scripture provides this impetus to reform those aspects in some senses. That is reaching back to the past in order to create more autonomy. But I'd argue that's how Mormonism has navigated Revelation. Is there's this reaching back into the past and then creating something new from it.
Yeah.
Well, that's the constant renegotiation
Yes,
that we have to engage in, but it's always done under the umbrella of the authority structures and the power and the rhetorical goals of the folks who are responsible for curating that renegotiation, so that it doesn't go beyond their grasp.
Sure.
Yeah, so I recently had the missionaries over. It was just last week, and I was asking them about.
Were they as handsome as the missionaries
Oh,
on
they
this
were
show?
so cute. One of them was a little ginger.
Did they bring you bread?
They should have.
Or butter?
Did you make this yourself? Or dinner? I was asking them about Elijah and how he got the priesthood, because it seems like he just like pops up out of nowhere. And I was confused. I really had no idea like where this was coming from, and they were like, oh well, like anybody who's worthy can, could have the priesthood. And I was like, really? So like when my like daughter gets sick or something, like if I'm worthy, right, like I could give her a blessing. And they're like, oh, like wait a minute, like back up a little bit. And they were like, well, you could just have your husband, like we could, right? And I was like, well, my husband's deployed right now. You know that because you can't go into my house. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, like when my daughter's sick or something, like there's this instance where, and my husband's deployed, like would the Lord hear my blessing? And, like not a prayer, because I understand the prayer, like that there's a,
You
like,
could fake a blessing. Sorry.
I could fake it till they make it, right? But, so I was asking about, like if there's, this kind of like short circuit way to be able to, find a way to give blessings, and if it's not always as structured as, that's where the question kind of formed to. And the sweet little ginger missionary, he was like, well then what would you need us for? And it hit me so hard. No, because I was thinking like, this isn't just.
Did you mean as missionaries or as men?
No.
Yes.
So I took, yes. So I was thinking as like as I've been like pondering his response, I keep thinking about how, like to find not just like to just like keep bitching about the same things over and over again, like treat women equal, like, well, what, like what can you do about it? Like if men are told their whole lives, like growing up through, like in the church, that their value is in holding the priesthood, then what is their value not? Like the same thing as women are taught, like their value is in having children. Well, what about women who can't have children? What about women? Your value is in your husband and being a wife. Well, what about women who aren't married? Things like this. And I think that so that it's the kind of dichotomy of, I think oppression is a hard word to say, but the dichotomy of value,
Marginalization,
right? Of saying like this
disparate
is
value.
this is how you become. This is your value. This is how you prove worth, not only to like your community, but to your superior being, right? This is your value. This is what you're supposed to do.
I mean, that's even on display in literally the language of the church. Like we use the word worth and worthiness to describe men much more than women.
Well, sure, but
Men have worth and women have value.
But in thinking about why it's been held on to, like why the priesthood has been something that was so, like such a hard spot to kind of like, oh, now we're giving it to blacks. Like what's next? Like gay men? Like what's that? Women? Like, oh, like wasn't it Kimball that like laughed at that? Like, oh, women will never have the priesthood. Like these kinds of things that, well, why? And I think that this kind of, I don't think it's the answer, but I think that for me it kind of like chipped away at it a little bit of thinking that, well, if this is our only value, if this is my only value as a man, then like that makes it even more like clinching, wanting to hold on to it. So in order to make it so that this isn't something
if the church would have no use for me, except for the fact that it needs me because I'm a man, it needs my priesthood.
Right.
But if it didn't, then it would have no use for me at all.
I think there are a number of
So
ways that
addressing that would be.
I think there are a number of ways that we develop rhetoric in order to emphasize these sharp divisions and clear lines, in order to show how important things are, without considering the implications of the rhetoric.
Yeah.
And the fallout of the rhetoric. For instance, I didn't grow up in the church. I have never heard in a live setting someone's talk about a licked cupcake or chewed gum. But that is rhetoric that was developed in order to try to escalate the importance of this. This is how important this is.
Not just sexual purity, but female sexual purity.
Right. And there is not a concern for what's the fallout of this? What is the implication of raising someone to believe that their value it can be taken from them like this? And you see people taking their own lives because of this kind of stuff.
That's the difference between worth and value too, because worth is something you're in control of. It's a product of your choices, but value is something that can be taken, you have or don't have by virtue of somebody else's choices.
And
Your
so
choices too, but like somebody can take your value from you. I don't know if there's any rhetorical frame in the church in which a worthy priesthood holder's worthiness can be taken by someone else.
And I think we spend so much time trying to develop that rhetoric in order to curate those sharp lines, and we ignore the result, the outcome, how it can hurt people. And the rhetoric that we use to try to emphasize how important these principles are kills people. And that's just such a phenomenally hurtful thing when that's the collateral damage of our structuring power. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, so I've noticed this a lot within the church. And I've also noticed when you try, okay, I'll just give a quick example. I went to church with my parents in like a super rich ward a while ago. And someone was sharing their testimony about their time as a missionary and how as a missionary, they came across a lot of food. They were in a very poor area and they met one of their investigators, or I think they're called friends now. But
Interested persons.
yeah, they met one of their investigators who had just lost their job and had no food for their 7 children. And so this missionary was like, well, I wanted to give them food, but then I felt the Holy Spirit tell me not to. And so I was talking to my parents about that, and I was like, okay, whether or not that was like a real revelation thing, I don't think this is the message that should be shared in an extremely rich ward where people have resources to be able to share. And this was after the pandemic started. I'm like, this is not the message that these people need to hear. And my parents responded to that with just getting mad, and they were saying, you're trying to censor the truth. And that is something I've heard so many times when trying to point out this thing that you're saying with good intention could teach the wrong thing.
The rhetoric is harmful, and they hear
Yes.
you're telling me that the truth is
Yes.
wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that gets into religious trauma a bit, right? So I have a lot of religious trauma. Yeah, I'm really sorry. But I do think that this goes back to this idea of boundary maintenance and circling the wagons. We sometimes, because we're in such a high demand space, which not placing a value judgment on high demand, that can lead us to have perceptions about our own worthiness, our own value with respect to the church, our own perception of revelation based on the boundaries that we perceive in the church, right? So, for example, when we have these revelations that sometimes seem off to us, that compel us to do things that might be harmful, that can often be because we are traumatized by this whole idea of boundary maintenance. So when I hear stories like that, I just think, oh gosh,
Like the idea of a
yeah,
corrupted boundary
agree.
terrifies us.
Yeah.
I think that there's a useful metaphor here, one that I've sometimes worked with in talking about these things, but that is if you stick to even almost like the spatial metaphor of like center and periphery and boundary and outside, the people that are usually most inclined to want to fire shots at people on the outside are the people that are closest to the middle.
Yep.
Which means that and the closer you are to the middle, the more likely that your co-religionists who are further on the margins are going to be caught in the crossfire. It's very, very difficult to take aim at people on the outside without also potentially accidentally, or maybe not entirely accidentally, catching the people that are between you and those outsiders, but still trying to be on the inside. And there's a good chance that the stronger your inclination to load up that musket, the more people there are in between you and the people that you're firing at.
And you're rewarded for that too, right? Because that reinforces your peer group's ideas about you. And so then as soon as you've stepped outside of that boundary even a little bit, you receive exile in some senses. It's not even a formal excommunication. The excommunication that hurts more than I think a formal excommunication is being pushed to the margins of your peer group within the church.
And I think DesNat is a good example of a group that has decided we're going to retract the boundaries and we're going to actually work on shoving these people out. And
So we can then fire them.
yeah, and I think it's so much worse for women than for men. Like I see women on social media in different spaces who are saying a lot of the same things I'm saying, but get attacked relentlessly by all kinds of people.
And more viciously, like they get threatened with sexual violence and just horrific stuff.
And it's a lot more condescending and in a lot of ways as well. But yeah, because the people find social capital in retracting those boundaries. It makes them feel like, well, you know, if I'm going to pull up the drawbridge and move back closer to the center of the castle, you know, I'm going to have a more prominent role therein.
And there's another kind of dynamic here too that dovetails with what you guys are talking about, which is that if you're close to the center and you're firing shots at people on the outside and hitting people on the margins of your community in the process accidentally, and somebody tells you and you're doing it in the name of something, like you're doing it in the name of a certain truth, right? Like this is true, this is a true principle, we have to stand for something, we have to stand our ground, and we have to be willing to fire those muskets, right? And then someone says, your musket fire is hitting people, right? Like hitting people that you shouldn't be being hit, right? And then you say, why are you attacking my defense of the truth? Are you against the truth that I'm defending? Right? Like it's entirely, the attack is an attack on tactics. And we, the more embattled we are, the more likely we are to perceive an attack on tactics as an attack on strategy or on motivation, on goals. And so it just makes us more defensive and more likely to want to keep firing our muskets.
There was an interesting study, I can't remember if I've mentioned it here in these discussions yet. I probably have, but in the cognitive science of religion, there's a lot of research on why religions persevere, what kinds of religions persevere, what's the relationship between pro-sociality and religious belief and things like that. And this fascinating study tried to divide religion into two different types of religion, and they labeled one God and the other religion. And the idea was, what is the priority within this community? Is it this vertical relationship with God? Is it doing what the deity expects you to do in order to get along better with humanity? And it was looking particularly at monotheistic religions because of this critique that monotheistic religions are uniquely and innately violent. And then the other kind of religion they looked at was religion where the priority was the boundaries and protecting the group from out groups. And what they showed was that the folks who prioritized the deity and the ideals of the deity actually had far more pro-social effects with the outgroup. They tended to increase cooperation with the outgroup, whereas the folks focused on what they labeled religion, that is the institution, the boundaries, the integrity of this group surrounded by all the outgroup members, they tended to increase conflict with the outgroup.
And both of these dynamics are very present in Mormonism, but not always in equal, or there's a big teetering back and forth, because there are times that we very strongly fit the description, and there are aspects of the church like missionary work and stuff, or service and community outreach, where we're actually like famous, like we show up in disasters and stuff like that, like we do a great job. And then there are others in which like the boundary maintenance is so harsh that not only is it like borderline abusive to people outside of the group, but actually abusive to people clinging to the margins.
Yeah.
What's that study called?
I'll pull it up.
Okay.
To relate this back to Banner, though, one of the solutions.
That's why we're here. That's
Sorry. To relate this back to Banner a little bit, though, I think the solution again is this nuanced, more progressive faith. I really do think Mormonism rewards orthodoxy, sometimes to the point of fundamentalism, in a way that is not healthy, in a way that, patriarchy harms all that are involved, right? It's not just women who are harmed by patriarchy, it's also men. And so in that sense, I think when we're talking about this boundary maintenance, one of the things that I think is really important to do is to ask, Lord, is it I, right? There are a lot of instances in our lives where we're going to have to transform our faith and be confronted with really hard questions of how do I contribute to this system in a way that, perpetuates fundamentalism, perpetuates harmful ideologies. And I think one of the bravest things that we can do is recognize that we're doing that in ourselves and then take steps to combat it, as opposed to simply looking at other people, right? I think it's important to have those conversations about examples of that and to, engage critically about that. But I also think, we have to engage critically about it within ourselves in order to do that in an effective way too.
I think we live a religion that in many ways demands we be changed by it. But we are far more comfortable with a religion that just confirms we're already good.
Affirms everything about us.
That makes us much more comfortable. And so when we engage scriptures that tell us we're doing it wrong, or teachings or things like that, that's uncomfortable. And I think that's an issue. We can't have our cake and eat it too.
I think something we need to reckon with as well, and this calls back to what we were talking about earlier about where is the line between mainstream and fundamentalism within Mormonism, is that I think it's easy for the average member in the church to look at somebody who's practicing polygamy or someone who is, practicing old temple rituals, whatever it may be, and be like, oh, that's fundamentalism. It's 200 years ago, so that's definitely fundamentalism. But I think it's a lot harder for us to look at things that were being taught in the 70s that are still being perpetuated today, even though they've been rescinded by the church or just haven't even been brought up for 50 years, and say that that is fundamentalism as well. Like, for a personal example, I found out this week that people in my ward have been complaining that I push a feminist agenda with my Relief Society lessons.
I would love to go to your lessons.
I know, anytime.
Oh, heaven forbid the Relief Society be too feminist.
Which, it's so funny because the original Relief Society was
I
so
turned
feminist.
the key over to the sisters.
I know, but
Brother
at the same time,
Joseph.
it's like the last time that feminism was spoken of evilly in general conference was probably 30 years ago. But that is still such a prevailing chain of thought within female communities in the more active circles of the church. And I think a lot of it has to do with our, one, not recognizing that as a form of fundamentalism, and two, our inability to separate the politics of our conservative religion with the theology of our religion.
I think Mormonism made a mistake when we uncritically accepted that we were part of the religious right. And I think that's a mistake that we're still paying for in a lot of senses, especially with what you said about, being told that you push a feminist agenda. A personal example is, so obviously I work and I'm unmarried, which means I'm a menace to society.
Leave.
I know that.
Yeah, I
You're not
know.
welcome here anymore.
Thank you, I appreciate it. But one of the really intriguing things for me is even because I work in church spaces, right? And I've almost always worked in church spaces for my adult life. I have not had a job since I was 18 that was not paid by the church, which is wild. But one of the things that I was continually told is, oh, you need to get married and stay home with your children. And I was told that in my graduate program, I was told that in undergrad, and it didn't matter how orthodox I was in other ways. That became the central identification. And I think for a lot of women, there are these boundaries that we still perpetuate, even though I have not heard a general authority say, hey, women need to stay home. In fact, if you look at who is called to serve in women callings, they all tend to work, which is just a really interesting phenomenon that we have this sort of cultural perception. And again, I think it comes from identity politics, right? Mormonism is married to the religious right. I think they need a divorce.
Well, and for women to kind of stick with that traditional role is a form of costly signaling, and so it's demanded.
It's soft
But-
power.
But at the same time, they need leaders who have administrative experience.
Actual experience.
Yeah, and so they need to put those women in positions of leadership, and so there's this awkward tension there that we just kind of ignore.
Are you supposed to admire Sherry Dew or Marjorie Hinckley?
Yeah. Do you have a comment?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, sir. You
Yes.
were gonna.
Yes.
I guess something that I've been thinking about throughout this series and listening to your comments talking about how we perceive, or members perceive themselves in the church, is about foundation myths and how that kind of, I don't know if it creates those boundaries or it helps to solidify those boundaries or set up those boundaries as far as who's in, who's out, what's acceptable and what's not. And as a convert, like, I didn't get all the history of like the massacres, all the, even really polygamy, like when I was taught in the missionary lessons, it's like,
Right.
oh, that's just something in the past, it's not, don't worry about it, kind of thing. And then learning about the actual, or some of the actual history of the church, I think really made me question, like, who's curating the foundation myths of this church, because it is such, a new church, the history is pretty recent. Those facts can kind of be sussed out a little bit easier than more ancient religions. And especially in this last episode when you saw the two different stories of the massacre from the Paiutes and from now, and it really kind of puts that into focus of like who is telling these stories and how is that influencing the trajectory of the way people think about their relationship to God, to power in the church.
Not to be that person, but Mormon history has been told mostly by men, but it's also been told mostly by white straight men in particular. So when we talk about my favorite TED Talk comes to mind, The Danger of a Single Story, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about the stories that are told about Mormonism, it's been consistently from that perspective. I don't know many stories of 19th century queer people. They did exist. We know that there were some 19th century queer Mormons. We don't hear their stories.
Mike Quinn talked about him and got
Yeah.
eviscerated by the
Exactly.
apologetic wing of the church.
But then that too like sets up the whole idea that there is this power structure in the church, and the prophet, whoever's in charge, kind of is the one that's supposed to kind of lay out all these rules, because he's the one that receives the revelation for the entire church and the rules of the church, and so anything outside of that shouldn't be considered, and it's, I don't know, from where I look at it, it's kind of like pushing against whatever the prophet's revelations are is kind of apostate. It's kind of
Sure, I've been called apostate a bunch of times.
right.
But I'm all for democratizing Mormonism in a very real sense, right? So that's also partially why I use the word Mormon. It's very deliberate. I consider myself a Mormon of a Latter-day Saint flavor. Because when we're talking about what I perceived the vision from Joseph Smith, and I will say, Joseph Smith, problematic dude. Most of our prophets, problematic dudes. But Joseph Smith also had this vision of acquiring truth from all locations, and Joseph Smith, at least according to some early accounts of women, did accept women revelation as having emphasis in doctrine for the church. The biggest example, of course, is Heavenly Mother. And when we're talking about how Mormonism got to this point, I think one of the big things is correlation. I think correlation really does solidify this idea that there's one prophet who speaks for the church, as opposed to Joseph Smith's more liberal democracy, which still, I will say, was exclusionary in very many ways. But if we're considering how Mormonism got to this point, I think it's definitely correlation, but also retrenching these gender roles. And I don't see that as inherent to Mormonism. I think one of the beauties of Mormonism is it's kind of a create your own journey in some senses. There are very few things that the church, in my mind, establishes as hard lines compared to other religions. Granted, I come from Catholicism, which has a catechism of these things, and while there are a lot of boundaries that are culturally pushed on, that I think we need to improve on not culturally pushing on, you can engage with Mormonism in a nuanced way and still remain a member of the church, at least depending on some other factors, right? And that in itself is problematic. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
There's I think I spoke a couple of weeks ago after the discussion about this idea that there are 3 different phases that religions develop into. They start out in a quarantine phase, which is basically you're keeping to yourself. You don't want anything to do with the other folks. You're protecting yourself from the outside world. And then there is oh, now I've forgotten the name of the second one. Oh, it's a word I use all the time too. But anyway, basically you are beginning to accept some stuff from the outside world. The syncretist phase. You're starting to
Incorporate outside material.
Yeah, and then the final phase is reform, where now the influences can go both ways, and you're kind of diffused into the broader culture. And when you look at religions that have been around for a long time, the reform phase is a lot more salient, and we're very much transitioning from a quarantine phase, and we're still seeing some vestigial aspects of that quarantine phase where we are trying to keep ourselves apart. But I think some of the things that are right, and other things, the way that we're trying to gain some purchase in the broader world is still kind of in its infancy. And so I think that's a difficult transition, where we're still trying to hold on to some parts of that past where we wanted to be different, while also trying to reach out and say, no, we belong, we're the same. I think in talking about our engagement with the Bible, Phil Barlow talks about in the 19th century, we stuck with the King James Version to belong, and now we stick with the King James Version to
Be different.
And so that's kind of almost the opposite kind of impact. So there are different ways that different parts of our culture are engaging in this, and it's boundary maintenance, it's identity politics, it's structuring power, it's engaging with our past in context that we have to take seriously, like our relationship with other churches, and what candidates for president we think we like, and focus on the family and all that kind of stuff. So it's an ongoing wrestle, and I think we're still centuries away from the point where we can engage this stuff the way that folks within Catholicism, folks within Judaism are able to engage.
And part of what prevents that is our belief that there's no need to think that far in the future. Right? So as long as we're still like this very millenarian, very like end times kind of movement, and the good news is we've seen a shift away from that thinking, not entirely away, and more in official discourse than I think on the ground level, but the difference in the sort of the imminence of the second coming, the last days, this is the final push, final generation. The difference in the rhetoric there, even from the 90s to now, is just monumental.
Well, also with the family too. When you brought up family, I've been thinking a lot about how we've shifted from talking about a nuclear family to the family of God, right? And I see the adoption of the nuclear family in Mormonism, at least, to be like a Benson relic, more so than it is something inherent to Mormonism. And so in that sense, when we're seeing this...
It was connected to Benson's emphasis on male headship too, which Hinckley also shifted away from. Yeah,
so since we're moving into the family of God, right, I think that is showing more of a tolerance for equity than we've seen before. So I am optimistic about the trajectory of Mormonism, perhaps a little too optimistic, but what you gotta do. At the same time, though, I do think Dan's right and Brad's right that this is going to take a long time, because when we negotiate these boundaries, right, it's going to feel like a step forward, but then 2 steps back every single time.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, you're
All
good.
the way in the back. Thank you for holding this event. It means a lot.
Thanks for coming.
For
Yeah.
sure. I wrote my question down so it's not all over the place, so hopefully it's good. But I feel like this show shows a core frustration, and it echoes, I feel, how a lot of people feel with the lack of accountability with the brethren when they get things wrong. Right?
Mhm.
This is a devil's advocate question, by the way. But this is my question. Why even pursue any kind of progressive agenda or any kind of accountability when the buck stops with the brethren? Wouldn't influencing them, and kind of echoing his question, wouldn't influencing them by default defeat the whole purpose of the restoration or having profits, if that makes sense? Like, for example, one of my good friends is Charlie Bird. He's dating my roommate. I put them together.
So cute.
I have a long story. However, his cause is just, but it contradicts the doctrine and the point of having brethren. Here is Charlie, a wonderful man, trying to influence a good thing and account, hey, why don't we have the rights, right? The brethren change their mind, domino effect. Does my question make sense? What's the point of progressive Mormonism when it cannot, by default, with the temple questions, you believe in the prophets, seers, and revelators, right? You gotta say yes. What's the point if you will not win? I'm playing devil's advocate.
Yeah,
If it doesn't, that's great. I'm out of it. However,
No, it's an
that's my
entirely fair
for me.
question.
Yeah.
I think
Please.
going back to where we talked about women, that clear line about stay in the home, don't work, that kind of stuff, and the tension of female leaders largely being folks who went out of the home and worked. That is pragmatism up against ideology and rhetoric. And so there's always going to be tension like that. And we could spend all day teasing out the ways that we are self-contradictory in how we live the religion versus how we talk about the religion. And a lot of that talking is that rhetoric that is primarily intended to signal certain ideas that frequently are more about signaling than about implementation, than about living. And that's not to say that it's not serious, doesn't need to be taken seriously, but when someone says, well, you can't do that because that contradicts the doctrine, that is adopting a clear line in an effort for rhetorical effect, basically. And this is something that folks who want to critique conservative religions do, is they will adopt the position of the most conservative within the religion in order to show that everybody else is, contradicting their own religion. So this goes back to the most pious are the most fundamentalist. And so there is also rhetoric about revelation being scattered among us. The 1978 revelation was not something that just came ex nihilo out of the sky. That was the result of enormous campaigns and
Agitation, outside pressure, inside pressure.
Yeah, and so while there is a desire to gin up this notion that the prophet could be locked away in a bunker and still lead the church with revelation without being exposed to anything, the reality is, and it could not be any other way, is that they are sending out surveys and polls every single day.
Oh, they're trying really hard to get put their finger on what the church membership thinks, on what they want.
A founding myth is that did happen. The prophet was locked in a bunker and was still able to lead the church.
And what does that founding myth use to do? It has a rhetorical purpose to emphasize that.
But the other founding myth is that somebody came to Joseph Smith and said, I hate cleaning up these spittoons. Can we please have a revelation on tobacco?
And suddenly there's a revelation on tobacco. And so without challenging...
and that's like a faith-promoting story, too. Like, that's not like some rogue way of interpreting that. Like, Emma literally asked.
So we will
put pressure.
We will contradict ourselves all the time as individual members of the church within the institution in order to serve our rhetorical exigencies. And so the church membership, if the tide shifts, everything else is going to follow. There is a worry about that, but you will never find, if 90% of the church says X, you're not going to have a president of the church saying, no, why? Y'all are wrong.
So why didn't the brethren beat them to the punch? It's frustrating.
Yeah.
Oh, it's incredibly frustrating.
Because they see
And-
themselves
yeah.
as caretakers of tradition
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
And they legitimately trust their own instincts as a barometer for, like, because it's gotten them where they are as leaders. It's benefited their rise in power in the church the entire time to trust their individual instincts as barometers for what God wants in terms of the direction of the church. And their instincts are almost always not necessarily reactionary, but conservative, right? Like preserve the status quo, honor the tradition, honor what you've been given, honor what's been preserved over time. And so it's a very, very inherently conservative institutional structure.
I will also say, for at least me, I feel you. It's incredibly frustrating, and I'm really sorry that you're in that place. I'm in that place in many ways too. For me, prophets and apostles are men. They're men with a calling, and I think the problem is culturally and institutionally we sometimes elevate them to be demigods, in a sense. And I think about how many times in my life I have been spectacularly wrong. I've been spectacularly wrong on so many social issues. I've been spectacularly wrong in the way that I've lived my life. Just so many times. And when I look at prophets and apostles, I try to simultaneously hold them accountable. Just like how when I'm held accountable, that's how I progress. Is when people criticize me and point out my blind spots and point out my flaws.
In good faith.
In good faith, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's how I have been able to change, and that's how I have been able to become more progressive and more compassionate. So when I hold that space for other people, I think that can be effective. But I will also add that not everyone has the liberty of being able to have the emotional capacity to do that. There are some situations in the church. I'm straight and I'm white and I'm female. I have female that causes me a lot of grief, but I also recognize that I have a lot of privilege within the church too, and that these issues don't always impact me as much as they impact other people. So I really think it comes down to negotiating how much emotional labor you can engage in with prophets and apostles, and being okay with the spot that you end up in. And I will say that doesn't make you any less of a Mormon in my eyes. You can still be a Mormon and have very nuanced and wild views.
For a long time in my sort of adult life in the church, I had sort of like two guiding principles when it came to managing this question of like the difficulty of prophetic leadership. One was a belief that I still hold today, although it has different implications now, but a genuine belief that the church would not be better off if most Mormons thought the way I did. In other words, I didn't think that it would be an improvement of the sort of the vitality of the community if everybody was everybody thought the way that I did. I felt like I was entitled to a space in the church, but that it was on the margin and that I was fine there. The other thing was, we actually have the rhetorical language to approach prophets and apostles very differently than we do. We have the sort of theological and cultural resources to do this differently. And the way that I would frame it to myself is I'd say, look, all of us faithful, devout Mormons believe that missionaries are specially called by God to do special work that only they can do. They are set apart specifically to do this work, that they are guided by God in the process. They have special access to revelation and inspiration and to guidance to do the work that they do, and that this work is crucially important. And we don't go anywhere near treating them as infallible. In fact, the faith-promoting way of approaching missionaries is actually to say, I know that God must be in charge of the work, because if he wasn't, the missionaries would have ruined it a long time ago, because they constantly screw things up. They're just constantly ruining everything, right? Missionaries are terrible, and yet somehow the work moves forward. So for a long time, it was just like, I just extended that logic all the way up the chain. I was just like, God has got to be behind this, because otherwise prophets and apostles would have ruined it a long time ago.
Yeah.
And that worked until the policy of exclusion.
Yeah.
And then it was like, well, that's still actually too much. You know, like
It's okay if it's too much.
President Nelson gets up and talks to young adults in a devotional in January and says, this was like 1978, this was a big revelatory moment, we were all, and it's like, I think you're lying. I really, really think you're lying. And it just like, that was it for me. So even with that rhetorical like material at my disposal, or that different way of approaching it that had been acceptable for a long time, like I still couldn't deal with, like, something still hit me, you know, like I still couldn't deal with, and I haven't really been active in church since then, you know, despite still having a very complicated relationship with you know, the faith claims of Mormonism or whatever, and in some ways still being very, very, very Mormon to my core, I just can't submit to his authority. And I could before that happened, you know? So it's really, really complicated is the best answer I have. And I want to pivot because I want to make sure that we make time for the actual reason, the primary reason, the most important reason why I invited Hannah. And I'm just going to let her describe it to you and everything. Like she knows why I asked her to come more than anything else. And then when she's done doing what she's going to do, we will hopefully still have time for a little more Q&A.
Okay. So when I started watching Under the Banner of Heaven, I had a lot of questions about Brenda in particular, because the first episode portrays Brenda. It's either the first or second. Sorry, it's been a while since I watched them. I watched them in like February. The first or the second episode portrays Brenda as standing outside, sipping lemonade. This is like weird lemonade picnic that's going on as men are tossing rocks into the back of the tractor-like thing. I don't really do outside stuff. And you just see Brenda run up to there and start throwing in the rocks. And a lot of people, when that scene happened, were like, oh, that's not true. That never happened to anyone. Well, it happened to me. I had a really interesting experience 3 years ago. It was a Relief Society Elders Quorum joint activity. The women were asked, hey, can you make lunch for the Elders Quorum as they build this hammock and mulch this area? And I was like, hell no, I'm not going to make lunch. I'm going to mulch the area. So, I got outside and I started mulching, and like, of course, the Relief Society sisters were kind of staring at me, and I was Relief Society president at the time, but they were staring at me and they were like, this woman is just so strange. And then of course, like, the Elders Quorum people, members, I guess is the better word, they were also staring at me like, what? Like, yeah, the lads. They were like, what is she doing? She's just, I was picking up worms and just like throwing them away, right? So that to me was a really important moment of my life, because that was one of the first times I gave myself permission to defy gender norms within Mormonism. And I know that sounds silly, but I'm one of the people that has really struggled with gender norms in Mormonism. And that's been probably the hardest thing for me, is I tried so hard to fit that mold, to be the perfect Molly Mormon, Orthodox, faithful Latter-day Saint, and I just never was. At least not truly. And so when I saw that scene, I was so compelled by Brenda that I decided, you know what? There's a million things that I could write about. I could write about the representation of Mormons, which I think everyone ended up doing, who wrote critiques of the show. But to me, that was entirely unimportant compared to who Brenda was. So I actually got to talk to Brenda's family to write my piece on Under the Banner of Heaven. And it took me months to do this. I interviewed her family members. I interviewed co-workers. So I literally sat at my little computer and I tracked down the department store that she worked in, the specific location. I wanted to know everything about her, because one of the problems that I've seen with the critiques of Under the Banner of Heaven is they don't focus on the victims. There are multiple victims in the show, not just Brenda and Erica. There's the stepdaughters of Dan and Matilda. And my friend, Dr. Christina Rossetti, is actually writing an article about them. There's victims of incest. There's other victims of domestic violence. And I was honestly appalled in a lot of ways that the most important thing to us seemed to be whether or not Andrew Garfield ate a French fry. That seemed ridiculous to me in just so many ways. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the life of Brenda Wright Lafferty, because I think that her life story is far more compelling than any FX drama could be. And I truly mean that. So Brenda Wright was born in 1960 on July 19th in Logan, Utah.
She's a month younger than my mom.
Oh, wild. Oh, you're young.
No, my mom's young.
So she was born in Logan, Utah, and her father, James Wright, at the time was finishing up a PhD at Utah State. Finishing up a master's degree at Utah State University. One interesting thing that I learned about her mother is her mother had a master's degree as well. Her mother, badass woman. Like, we're going to get into her mother a little bit because that woman's amazing. And her mother, helped James throughout his graduate school career. And in her mother's obituary, they wrote that her mother, Lorraine, basically got a PhD along with her husband, because one of the things that we don't recognize is that in graduate school, wives are often compelled to do unpaid labor of taking notes and writing papers for their husbands. So that was her mother. And her mother, amazing person, and she had two older sisters, Betty and Bonnie. And they moved from Logan, Utah to Ithaca, New York, to Cornell University. This was when Brenda was only 1 year old. And I've heard from both Sharon, the mother, and also secondhand from the father, that at the time, Brenda was learning how to walk. She was learning how to walk when they were still in Utah. And then they got into a car, they drove across the country, and Brenda forgot how to walk. Which I just thought was such an interesting detail. But then they got this amazing picture of her walking for the first time in Ithaca, New York. She was just sitting down and got up and just went for it. And her family described her as ambitious and a go-getter to me. Her early years, she was considered one of the most interesting people at her school. So the way that their school system worked is, it was a school in Idaho, because after James finished his PhD, they moved first to Idaho Falls, then to Kimberly, Idaho. Idaho, obviously, very small town type feel. So the school was a high school, middle school combined. And when Brenda was in middle school and high school, she was an amazing singer. She also did theater in high school. She scrapbooked. But she also, was one of the most beautiful people in the school, according to her sisters. And everyone would just stare at Brenda. And I will say that one of the things that bothered me about the show was the sexualization of Brenda. Because the way that her sisters described her beauty was in really just pure and angelic terms. Like, for them, it was just not only what she looked like, but who she was. But the show reduced her to who she looked like. One of the really interesting things about Brenda's high school experience is that she had very young siblings while in high school. So, like I said, there was Betty and Bonnie, but then after Betty and Bonnie, she had four other siblings that were younger than her. And she would take...
All B names?
No. Because there's Jeanette, there's Sharon, there's Stephen, and then, I forget the last one. Andrew. And the interesting thing is, one of the younger sisters, Jeanette, was so young that Brenda would just carry her around. And I just thought that was one of the most beautiful things. At the time, their mom was kind of overwhelmed. Their mom, like I said, badass woman. She would sew dresses for her children all through the night, so that way they can have homemade dresses. She was in charge of canning for the Relief Society. This was back when Relief Societies did joint canning activities. And she would can hundreds of cans in a week. I don't know if anyone has canned before. Very difficult, back-breaking work. It's also very hot. You have to put the jar in the water and, seal it, basically. And you hope that you don't get botulism. But Lorraine was out doing that, but also was a stay-at-home mom. And when she wasn't a stay-at-home mom before, she had taught, she had worked as a secretary, but she had done that to save money for her children to go to college. One of the cool things that Brenda's family told me, and they all said this, was that college for all their children was not like an if, it was a when. And it was not an if, it was a where. And Brenda was empowered by her family members throughout her entire life. When she told her dad, there's that scene when they're in the car, right? And it portrays her dad as being like, oh no, you're not going to go to college away from us. That's not what happened at all. When she told her dad that she wanted to go to school, her dad was like, yes, we're paying for it. We're going to support you this entire way. You should do what you want. And her family described to me that they have they had a very progressive faith. A couple of her siblings have left the church since, and still have very nuanced engagements with Mormonism. But for them, that was how it always was. It wasn't something that was, that came about in a more modern era. For them, they always were welcoming people, and that's who Brenda was too. My favorite story...
For generations, Ithaca has been seen as like a hotbed of progressive Mormonism.
Oh, I actually didn't know that. That's so cool.
Ithaca and Ann Arbor were like, whether you see that as good or bad, depending on who you are, they've definitely both been seen as hotbeds of Mormon progressive, and Cambridge.
Okay, yeah. I mean, Cambridge is where I'm from, right?
Yeah.
So, like, Cambridge and Berkeley were the ones that...
Yeah.
That's so cool. One of my favorite stories about Brenda, though, is Sharon told me this story. Sharon is one of her younger siblings. Sharon was in middle school when Brenda was murdered. Sharon told me this story of how when she was really young, she wanted to donate to pennies by the inch. I think this is the most hilarious story. And so basically the primary was collecting pennies, and the idea of it was, we can donate enough pennies to the hospital that something good could happen, right? But Sharon went into Brenda's room and stole $5 from her. At the time, Brenda worked at the Sears department store. By the way, her favorite snack, in case you're wondering, I have her favorite snack and her favorite flour. Her favorite snack were the sesame sticks that were underneath the heat lamp. That was apparently the nut counter at Sears department store. I didn't even know that there was a nut counter at Sears department store. I think that might be a generational thing. And her favorite flowers were roses. Specifically yellow roses, not any other color, but yellow, that's what I was told. So Sharon stole this $5 bill. She brought it into primary, and this is, a small town in Idaho, like I mentioned. So after primary, the primary president waltzed over to the right home and brought the $5 back to her mom and was like, hey, your primary child gave me $5. Because $5 now, we're like, oh, okay, that's like 2 sodas at Sodalicious. No, $5 back then was not 2 sodas at Sodalicious. It was like $20 or something. I don't even know. Probably more with inflation nowadays.
It was a tank of gas is what it was. I'm not joking. It was a tank of gas.
Oh, wild. Okay, yeah. I didn't know that actually. So she brought back the $5, and then of course Brenda comes out of her room and she knows that Sharon stole the $5, and Brenda's reaction was not at all to be angry. Brenda's reaction was immediately, she forgave Sharon, and she was like, let's donate the $5 to pennies by the inch. And that's who Brenda was. Every story that I've heard about Brenda has been, Brenda would do my hair before church. Brenda would write me letters. Brenda would, when I had a hard day at school, go out and get me gourmet popcorn. The popcorn that Brenda got for her siblings, she got it multiple times, was this, and I have a picture of it somewhere, was this set of 3 popcorns. One was white cheddar, one was like caramel corn, and the other one was kettle corn. And her family just remembered these tender moments of Brenda doing just tender acts of kindness for her family. Her siblings also described to me that when she went to college, so she went to 3 different schools. And I'm glad I got to clarify the record on this because people were confused. Did she go to University of Idaho or Idaho State? Wrong. She went to both. So she went to those 2, and then she went to BYU. But she would have her younger siblings come stay with her in her apartment for like a week when she was in college, and she would just take them to amusement parks. She would take them to get ice cream. She was her siblings' best friend all the time, and she would, one of her younger siblings recounted to me her story of one time when she was having a really rough time at home because her favorite sibling, Brenda, was gone, that she wrote Brenda a letter, and she said, hey, I want you to come get me. I need to be away from home. I need to be with you. Brenda immediately when she got the letter, of course, immediately when you get a letter is kind of an oxymoron. Immediately when she got the letter, just came down and took her for a week and just took her wherever she wanted. And so when I heard these stories about Brenda, I was just struck by how kind she was to her siblings, how much she loved the people around her. And I also want to talk about Brenda's faith, too, because this was really interesting to me. I wanted to know, because the show portrays her as having this progressive faith, and, the family has been critical of the series, particularly the portrayal of Brenda, but also just critical that the series was made in the first place. And one of the things that they told me was that Brenda was portrayed as too much of a Molly Mormon in the series. And for me, I was a little bit surprised because I was like, oh, I didn't think she was a Molly Mormon in the series at all. But the way that Brenda's faith worked is that they told me that she believed in the plan of salvation. She believed that God wanted all of his children to come back. But she didn't really discriminate in any sense. They said the most powerful thing about Brenda is that no matter who a person was, she embraced them and welcomed them. And this was really made clear when she was doing a beauty pageant. So when she was doing a beauty pageant, which was really cool. So in 1980, she competed in the Miss Twin Falls, Idaho pageant. She did very fun things, like she would take lemon juice and put it in her hair and go outside. One of my favorite stories, and I didn't include this one in the article, I wanted to though, is that she would have her two younger siblings slice up lemons with their mom, and she would ask them to bring her out the lemon slices so that way she can put them on her hair. And her younger siblings just thought that was like the best summer activity to do, right? When you're young, you like doing weird things for your siblings. I don't know, I guess I did. But that's how much her siblings loved her. They just thought that this was the best thing that they could do. They wanted to cut up these lemon slices and bring them out to Brenda just so that they could spend time with her. Anyways, she lightened her hair. She sang Somewhere Over the Rainbow in her performance. But I got to talk with, very briefly, a couple of the contestants from the Miss Twin Falls, Idaho pageant, because the amount of impact that Brenda had on people was that it was so strong that even 20 years later, I was able to find Facebook posts from people who knew her, writing about how outsized her friendship had an impact on them. So I got to talk to these women, and they said that during the pageant, there was some cattiness amongst the contestants, which is to be expected, but that Brenda was not catty, but that Brenda told them that they looked beautiful, that Brenda helped them with their hair, that Brenda made sure that their dress was zipped when one time one of their dresses came unzipped. And for me, this was so compelling because I saw Brenda as just the kindest person in the series. And to find out that the real Brenda was even more kind than that was one of the most honestly sacred experiences of my life. So she went to BYU, like I mentioned, and she wanted to become a broadcast journalist. She landed a job very quickly as a news anchor on the daily news show, and she wrote in her journal, I have not read these entries, I have heard about the entries from someone who has read them, and she wrote in her journal about how much she wanted to have an impact on people, how she wanted to be the biggest news anchor in the United States of America, I think she could have been, and also the opposition that she sometimes faced. But she was funny about it. She didn't write about it in like a she was sad about it. She kind of wrote about it in a snarky way, in a way that she was like, you know what, I'm not going to let these people bring me down because my family taught me better. And to me, that just testifies to how amazing her parents were to her. And so she landed this job as a news anchor on this TV series, and in 1982, that's when she met Alan Lafferty. And I think that this part of the story is really important to tell because it's not as clear in the series. She met Alan Lafferty. They go home to meet Brenda's family, and Alan does not bring an anti-tax book. They did not know that he was anti-tax at this point. But he does light a bush on fire. It's just not around Christmas. It's around 4th of July. The family really likes Alan, but they don't know him super well because her family's in Idaho. And so then what happens is they get married the same weekend that she graduates, just to save her family the trip, is what she said. And she goes through the temple that week, And going through the temple was one of her favorite experiences. Her older sister had served a mission, and so her older sister was endowed. And her older sister was the only person she wanted to go through the temple with. Her family went too, but like she was exclusively excited about going through the temple with her older sister Betty. That was the highlight. And I've heard this from multiple people, which I just think is so cool. These people that, you know, knew her back then all remembered that she was just so thrilled that her sister could go through the temple with her. So she goes through the temple. She loves the temple. She ended up going, I said weekly in my article. That's technically true because she stopped going as much when she got closer to her murder. But she would go up to twice a week after she got endowed. The temple was her favorite thing about Mormonism, which I find very interesting. So anyway, she got married and she almost immediately got pregnant with baby Erica. Erica's full name is Erica Lane Lafferty. And she was born, and Eric and Brenda decided that, you know, she wanted to still pursue her career goals, but she also wanted to stay at home with her children. So Brenda's plan was always to have a family, to have a few kids, but to be an industrious stay-at-home mom like her mom. Brenda loved her mother, and her mother did so much for the family. Her mother made ceramics. Her mother made textiles. Her mother canned, like I mentioned. Her mother just made their family life so unique and so powerful for Brenda that's who Brenda admired. But she definitely still wanted to work. And she did not feel, at least according to what her family said, she did not feel like that made her any worse than others. And there are plenty of individuals, including the sisters-in-laws, but also her friends, who remembered how Brenda encouraged them to work too. A lot of the women that she met would say things like, I want to do X for a career, but I have to get married and have children, or I'm already married, so I need to have children. And Brenda would say, no. You do what you want, and you stand by that. But things with Alan definitely got really weird. And this is a very hard thing to talk about. Alan started hanging out with his brothers Dan and Ron a lot. And Brenda considered getting a divorce from Alan. She was talking about moving to Montana, and because she had a degree, she was certain that she could land a job as a news anchor there and she could support herself. At least according to, and I'm going to try to nuance this as much as possible, according to Betty, Alan Lafferty knew about the removal revelation. Now, the removal revelation is the revelation to murder people like Brenda, Erica, Chloe Lowe, others that were on the list. According to Sharon, Alan did not know. According to Dan, Alan did know. According to Ron, Alan did not know. So you can see why this is a very complicated matter. At the same time, though, it does seem like Alan and Brenda had a really rocky relationship at this point, and she was thinking about leaving him. But within 3 months, she was murdered, and her baby was murdered too. The only memory that I was able to get of baby Erica, because baby Erica was 15 months at the time that she was murdered. She didn't live a very long life at all. She didn't have the opportunity to do much, but every member of her family talked about eating ice cream with Erica, which I just thought was really this idiosyncratic detail. But for me, it was super meaningful to think about how the first memory that they had of her was they ate ice cream together. And since Brenda's family lived in Kimberly, Idaho, they didn't get to see baby Erica all that much. So that memory was really meaningful to them. And Brenda and Erica were murdered on Pioneer Day of 1984. And one of the things that the family has all told me that I haven't shared yet is that this really changed the way that they thought about Pioneer Day in a way that they can't celebrate it anymore. For them, it's just this horrific and tragic day. And for them, that has really shaken them to their core about what Mormonism can do. But a lot of them have stayed members of the church. Like I said, some left, some stayed. But all of them have mentioned how much Brenda impacted them. Brenda caused them to see life very differently. Even though her life was short, she accomplished a lot. In fact, the quote, it's on her grave. So she had she had her first funeral service in American Fork, because she and Alan lived in American Fork. Her second funeral service was in Twin Falls, Idaho, at Sunset Memorial, and that's where she's buried. And the quote on her gravestone is the quote that she wrote in her yearbook. And the quote reads something like, the amount of life lived will be remembered less than what was accomplished in that life. And her sister told me that this was almost prophetic, right? And I remember seeing the quote the first time, and I thought, oh, maybe her father wrote that, because her father loved Brenda. No, Brenda wrote it. And I can't imagine what Brenda would have accomplished had she been able to live, and what Erica would have accomplished had she been able to live. So I guess my plea to you is, when we watch these types of series about Mormonism, Murders Among the Mormons is another example of this, right? I think it can be really easy to want to debate what happens in Mormonism, and I think that those are important conversations. I have those conversations all the time. At the same time, though, the people that were murdered had real lives. They had family and friends, and I cannot imagine if I was murdered and the only thing that I could find on the internet about me was the day I was born and the day I was killed and how I was killed. But that's the reality for these victims. And Sharon, the sister that I talked to the most, I did talk to other sisters though too. Sharon, the sister I talked to the most, told me that I wrote the only piece about Brenda Wright that mentioned just her, not her murderers. I specifically didn't name her murderers in the piece. And that talked about her life. And for me, that was one, like, of course I felt like, wow, that's really cool. But she was murdered in 1984. I wrote this in 2022. So again, my plea is to, during these conversations, right, remember that there are real victims, and remember that the more compelling stories are always the ones that are the victims' lives, not how they were murdered.
Thanks, Stu. Appreciate having you here. I appreciate the work that you put into researching that and writing it. I appreciate the fact that the news was willing to publish it. It's an important bright light coming out of the complicated picture of this series, and it's the public response to the series. So I speak for everybody in the room when I say I really appreciate it. We're pretty low on time, but does anybody have any wrap-up comments or questions before we?
What's the name of that article?
It's called Under the Banner of Heaven Describes Brenda Lafferty Wright's Death. Here's Her Life. It's on Deseret News.
And I'll just add, I think I've known a lot of people in the church, particularly a lot of women, who've led lives like these, who are never going to have articles written about them. And it's unfortunate that we only hear about this kind of stuff in the context of the significance of their murder to contemporary debates about Mormonism. I would love to see these kinds of lives celebrated because of the lives themselves. And hopefully someday we can get to a point where we celebrate those folks like that.
Yeah, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich is one of the people that has definitely pioneered the way to do that. But I definitely think the lives of quote unquote ordinary women are often shoved aside because we have incorrect ideas about women's labor and women's outsized impact.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for being here for these discussions. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
So what I heard is we should rename Pioneer Day Brenda Lafferty Day.
I think so. I will say there is a Brenda Wright Lafferty Memorial page, and you can donate to victims groups there, and you can donate to a memorial that's trying to be established.